Well, hello there and welcome to the first Marketing Scoop recording of the year. We're going to be recording episode 13 of season 2 of Marketing Scoop with many Easter eggs in it. We will go live properly in the next 3 or 4 minutes or so. Of course, we're live on YouTube. We're recording the video on YouTube, but this is a podcast we're recording as well, and the podcast will be published in the next 3 or 4 hours or so. So what is the podcast? I hear you say, if you are not subscribed already. The podcast itself is called Marketing Scoop, and you can find it in all your good podcatchers. Just go to semrush.com/podcast and click on one of the subscribe buttons. The one most suitable for you, it could be iTunes, Android, Stitcher, Overcast, Spotify. Those links are all there on that page. There's about 30 episodes or so that you can consume that we've published so far. We're publishing on a weekly basis, and this one, of course, like most of the others, broadcast live at 5 p.m. GMT, 12 p.m. EST on a Wednesday. So we've got some people joining us live already, I see. We've got people participating in the chat. We've even got a couple of our guests who are going to be coming on participating in the chat as well. And we've got people joining us from Amsterdam. We've got people joining us from London, from Canada, from Mexico. Where in the world are you? Why don't you share that in the chat? It would be good to find out a little bit more about you and where you happen to be, what you happen to be doing as well. The focus of this particular episode is going to be SEO testing and how that overlaps with CRO, plus probably a couple of other things as well. So perhaps you can tell us a little bit about the area of focus that you happened to be involved in at the moment within your roles. Maybe you're a full-time SEO, maybe you're a general digital marketer, maybe you have a focus in another area of digital marketing. Tell us a little bit about you and what you're doing at the moment, just to give us a feel of who you are and what your main area of focus is in your work life. And also, we, as we're focusing on SEO testing, if you have any specific questions in relation to that, please share that in the chat as well. And we will try and share that as part of the show and ask our wonderful guest panel that we will introduce you to just in a second, the questions that you happen to be asking in the chat. We've got people joining us from Vermont, from Florida, Lingfield. Where's Lingfield? And we've got Judith Lewis saying, hello, world. And that's just a nice general introduction, just because she's a little bit lazy. She doesn't want to say hello to everyone. Anyway.
Well, hopefully everybody is having some chocolate or something enjoyable from their Christmas stash.
3 minutes and 24 seconds. Yeah.
I had to get it in.
So, Judith says she's found my Easter egg in the introductions, but has she found all of the Easter eggs? We'll see as we get going with recording the podcast proper. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click the introduction music. We're going to be recording properly, and that last 3 or 4 minutes, of course, isn't what you'll get as part of the actual podcast. It's a bonus for you video watchers. Let's get going with the podcast. Marketing Scoop Season 2, Episode 13. What are the SEO tests that you should be conducting in 2019? We're broadcasting live on the SEMrush YouTube channel. This is Marketing Scoop. I'm David Bain.
And I'm Judith Lewis. And welcome to the SEMrush show that reveals the latest digital trends and technologies that impact your marketing strategy.
Together with industry experts, we delve into SEO, advertising, and content marketing to uncover the ultimate recipe for digital marketing success. Let us meet today's guests. So first up, a man that enjoys cooking, playing basketball, and drinking whiskey, and not necessarily in that order. He's the founder and CEO of online marketing agency Distilled. Welcome to the Scoop, Will Critchlow.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for coming on, Will.
Next up, a man whose secrets include having dynamic, decisive processes, a phenomenal team, and going to bed with inbox zero. I hope his wife doesn't mind. He's the CEO and director of organic search at Peak Ace AG, and he's joining us live from his sauna in Berlin. Welcome, Bastian Grimm.
Good evening, everyone. Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for joining us.
And don't tell her, right?
About your sauna or about
Probably both.
Well, also joining us today is a gentleman who's overseeing the launch of Spark, a Meta CMS for SEO Teams, powered by Cloudflare Workers. Welcome to the head of search at Strategic, Chris Green.
Hi, all. Thanks for having me.
We'll be chatting to Chris a little bit later, but let's start off with what best practice SEO testing looks like in 2019. So I'll start off with Will. What are some of the top things that an SEO should be testing this year?
Well, so our view is that most of the things that we do on site are things that we need to be testing more and more. So essentially, any of your on-site optimization work, we think that this is, looking at the trends from Google as they get more machine learning powered, it becomes more of a black box. It becomes, we can't just rely on the best practices or things we might have done in the past. And so we're really finding that the scope is essentially everything on site. It's obviously much harder to test off-site elements. And so I guess there's a kind of risk reward kind of matrix. There's a bunch of things that you probably want to do as just hygiene factors. They're not worth the effort to test. If it's quick to update, then and relatively unlikely to do harm, then sure, just go for it. But any of those areas where I think we've all had them, should we do it this way? Should we do it that way? I don't really know. I'm not sure. How many links is too many in the sidebar? Or, should we target the higher volume head keywords on these pages, or have slightly longer tail, different kind of structure, language? It could be anything from technical setup of the page to the more kind of content-centric, keyword-focused elements. We're trying to test all of those things. And so I guess the easier end of things to test is things that only affect the page they're on, or mainly affect the page they're on. So yeah, technical elements, anything from structured data to HTML structure, that kind of thing, meta information, through content on the page. So like say keyword targeting, that kind of stuff. One of the big areas that we've seen rewards from is testing things that affect click-through rate from the search results, not just ranking. So meta title and description and so forth. Obviously structured data playing part of that as well. The things that are a little bit harder, but I think important, and we're probably going to try more of, is things like internal linking structure, where it's the hypothesis is a little more complicated, because you're kind of saying, we're changing these pages over here, but it's those pages over there that we expect to perform better. And so the testing, the statistical approach can be a little bit more complex, but that's where we're coming from. We think this is the way to more effective, more accountable search outcomes, and we're finding enough confounding, confusing, unexpected results that we're just seeing benefits to testing as much as we can. It's not necessarily true that things that work in one place work somewhere else, or vice versa.
So when you're looking at these testing, you named a number of elements that also impact on UX, things like sidebar links and whatnot. Are you also looking at what happens after the user arrives on the site, or are you purely looking at SEO testing, just how you're ranking and then getting from the SERPs onto the page?
No, we're absolutely doing both. So there's a couple of different ways of looking at it. So when we're talking pure SEO testing, we mainly tend to measure the results of that test in organic traffic, and I can talk a little bit more about why we think that's the right metric. There's arguments for different kinds of metrics, but we tend to use that as the main one. Then what we've been talking about recently is combining that into what we call full funnel testing, which is essentially saying, like you say, not just the acquisition, but through to the conversion as well. And I think, I don't know if this fits with everybody else's experience, but my experience has been that typically those things have been quite siloed. So, a UX CRO team will be relatively siloed from an SEO or an organic acquisition team, and they might worry about each other's outcomes sometimes. In particular, I think it's pretty common to see both teams worry about SEO changes screwing up UX. and relatively less common to see organizations worry about whether their kind of CRO or UX changes are going to mess up their SEO. I think we've probably all seen the horror stories on that side. And so this is one of our big product updates in our tool recently was to say we want to be able to measure this all the way through. So we're running simultaneous stuff. So we're measuring the SEO tests simultaneously with the conversion rate impact. And yeah, you can see them independently. So you can say there are certain kind of changes that come out being positive on one and negative on the other, for example. And then you've got options. You can either say, this is too risky, we're not rolling it out. You can say the upsides outweigh the downsides. This is something we should deploy, even though it has those downsides. Or my favorite when you can is that obviously you have these, you came into it with a hypothesis of why this was going to be good for one and good for the other, or good for one and neutral for the other. And so maybe you can then tweak it based on what you've seen, which is to say, can we capture the upside? Suppose you've got a positive SEO test and a negative CRO test. It's like, can we capture the SEO upside and remove or mitigate whatever was causing the UX issues while maintaining that upside? So, maybe run a subsequent test or whatever. And I think, yeah, I mean, our experience is that we're definitely seeing things that have outcomes in different directions. And so we think that this kind of thing is going to become more important, and again, fits with our long run thesis of how Google is trending, because more machine learning, more user experience data into the ranking algorithms, all this kind of stuff, like it's aligned to say, let's think about user experience, never mind the obvious kind of business impacts of getting it right or wrong.
Yeah, it's interesting that you're talking about full funnel testing, but the ability to separate things out so that you can look at it in a silo if you want to, but you are tracking everything through. So you mentioned also that sometimes you have an impact which is positive for SEO but negative for CRO or UX. Do you think that there's any area of SEO that could be tested without thinking about CRO, or do you think that they're too intimately linked?
Yeah, I mean, there are certainly things where our hypothesis would be this will have an impact on one and no impact on the other. So, for example, something like structured data is pretty unlikely to affect conversion rate. It's generally pretty invisible to the user. I mean, I guess maybe it affects who clicks through from the search results, but our assumption would probably be that would be a null CRO test. And I certainly don't see many CRO professionals going around running structured data tests. And I guess the flip side is there are plenty of CRO tests that don't affect SEO, at least in any way that we know about right now, on pages behind a login area or in the checkout funnel, or those kind of things. Those aren't affecting the rankings of your index pages.
Okay, so we can test things separately, but really
Sometimes.
Everything seems to have an impact on everything else. So.
Well, yeah, we think there's a huge bit in that intersection of the Venn diagram, a whole load of stuff that are on tests on index pages that are visible to users. If it has those two things, then there's a potential impact on both.
So also, if we're looking at testing, we also need to be looking at measuring. So what do you feel are the key metrics we need to be tracking for SEO, and maybe segueing into what key metrics apply for both SEO and CRO testing? So just what should we be tracking as part of our testing, and what metrics would apply for both as far as CRO and SEO?
So when we're looking just at the SEO testing portion of this, the way that we work as the kind of KPI on most of our tests is organic search traffic. And that is the primary metric. It's not the only thing we track, but it's the key thing we run the statistical analysis on to say, is this a statistically significant uplift? The reason for that is that is the single metric that captures both ranking position and click-through rate. If you were to just track rankings, for example, you would miss any impact on click-through rate. And we then tend to sense check it with the CRO side of things. So obviously what that misses is conversion rate kind of impacts. We've found that I won't say impossible. We've found it very hard to measure with statistical confidence SEO uplifts by looking at conversion rate changes, or rather number of conversions changes. They're just too sparse and two, there's other sources of statistical noise, right? So pricing changes, competitor pricing changes, like there's a million different other things going on that just add statistical noise. And so we isolate them out as two tests. So we're kind of saying, are we confident that there's been an uplift or not in organic traffic? And separately, is there an impact on conversion rate? And so the conversion rate metrics are the ones that you'd always be used to, just the same way that CRO testing has always been done. On the SEO testing side, KPI is organic traffic, and we tend to find that because we're generally working with pages that rank better for the kinds of things they were already ranking for, that kind of stuff, you tend to get more of the same kind of traffic. So the raw SEO element of the test is conversion neutral. It's only if the page is different for users that that side of things comes into play. And so that means that, so then in addition, we tend to track rank. So we'll have rank tracking going on in parallel. That's more for debugging. That's more for understanding the test. That's like, was this a conversion rate improvement or was this a ranking improvement? When you want to explain things, that's when you need your ranking data. For actually just measuring it, we're primarily looking at organic sessions.
And we'll get, sorry, Judith.
It's interesting that you mentioned about rank tracking, because of course, this is one of the things that many SEOs use as the main metric that they measure of a day for every client or for their bosses. Rankings seem to be the thing that everybody focuses on, but what you're focusing on is only rankings as a debug method, and you've got other metrics that you're working with. So that's very interesting, I hope, to our listeners.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to think rank tracking is a very important part of the mix. It's really important for detecting problems. It's really important for explaining stuff. It's really important for debugging. I don't like it as a KPI. I think that it's not close enough to business outcomes. You lose any sense of how many people are searching for this thing, how many people are clicking on it, what are they doing when they get to your site, and it also misses most of the long tail. Like, no matter how well you set up rank tracking, you're never tracking the entire universe. So I think that that's why I kind of prefer the slightly more analytical or analytics-based KPI. I guess that covers the main objections around it.
We'll get to Bastian just in a second. I'd just like to ask you one more question. And I was talking to Alexander Royal, the head of search for BBC Good Foods and Top Gear recently. And he's done a lot of testing and testing on recipe pages that have brought in a lot of traffic, but they weren't actually ranking for featured snippets. So he was thinking that there was potential, even though it was ranking #1, to get a lot more traffic by ranking for that. So what he did was he tested solely based on UX and actually reduced the amount of text on a page to try and improve the user experience, and ended up getting the featured snippet through that. But it wasn't through any conventional SEO thinking as a way to actually get those featured snippets and improve the SEO. Have you run any tests that were actually just based on UX principles and ended up improving your SEO because of it?
It's a great question. I mean, so I think, first of all, just philosophically, I'm totally aligned with that. I love that kind of thinking. And I wrote a post about how split testing has changed consulting for us. So we started building our optimization delivery network platform a couple of years ago now, and it's gradually been becoming more and more part of how we operate with clients. And so the way it works at Distilled is we have this software platform and software team, and we have some customers who just use the software themselves, and we have obviously some old consulting clients, and we have some people where we're doing consulting and they have the software in place, and we're able to run tests for them, suggest tests and all this kind of thing. And it's fascinating. So we end up recommending tests that look nothing like traditional SEO recommendations. We end up, but not just in that way. So not just in this looks like a UX test. We also end up recommending things that don't necessarily come from the data. They're much wilder hypotheses in some ways. It's like, why don't we see if this makes a difference? And I think probably the more concrete example I've got of that is less on the UX side, it's more on the keyword side. And so we've talked about this in a couple of kind of conference presentations, I think, that I think most SEO professionals, I certainly have made recommendations in the past where you do some keyword research, you find a higher volume variant of a key phrase, and you recommend, you say, hey, we should target this instead of this other way that you're writing about it. And we've actually run tests that show that that is, in some circumstances, a bad idea. It's actually net negative. In some cases, strongly net negative, because sometimes you're moving into a position where you can't compete, you're not ranking as well, or maybe it's got lower click-through rate, it's less compelling. There's a whole load of these kinds of things. And so we're definitely finding that we are certainly running tests where the hypothesis is not a recommendation we would have made to a client if we couldn't run the test.
Bastian, what are your thoughts on what Will's been sharing so far and your own perspective on what people should be testing for in SEO at the moment?
Well, I think it's pretty much aligned, actually. And I guess the reason is that we, like as an agency, we also started building something, well, probably less far, in a sense of like wide with functionality as the ODN does, but I mean the general idea of getting rid of the issue to actually need to change content management system, but rather be able to do things on a like we said, we called it server side level. So basically before we need to kind of find dev resources, because like one of the things that's quite interesting is if you look at large organizations is that operations teams have way more resources available versus the actual guys that need to change code on a CMS side. So if you can get into the server ops team, it's oftentimes easier to implement things. So what we ended up doing years and years ago was building a module that basically hooks into Apache, so that we can just before the final code will be like the HTML will be sent back, kind of modify the output. So it's essentially the same story, just on the server level. And I totally agree with what Will said on the general level. I mean, that makes things so much more easy because you can start testing things without having to change the final software product. I mean, if you come down to this discussion about having to prioritize things and do business values with it, it's extremely hard to compete. And so, we want to build in, I don't know, schema markup XYZ. I mean, what's the business impact? What's the value that it can drive, right? Or even things like let's change the entire set of titles and descriptions for like better CTR, right? I mean, that's very hard to anticipate. But if you can just run a test without having to touch a system in general, it makes it just way easier to build a case around it, because then you can just do it times X and you have an idea of what the outcome is. So generally, and also in terms of measurement, I totally agree. And my one addition I have to maybe do in terms of like rankings. I mean, the other big issue that most people are still not aware of is the fact that, I mean, they're just flawed, right? I mean, in a sense of what you track, it's not a real world. I mean, of course, the tools kind of get a default ranking without localization, or sort of localization without personalization and all of those things. So, I mean, yes, debugging, totally agree. And maybe even, do one set for desktop, one for mobile, whatever that means. But ultimately, traffic is what counts. I would then probably add some of the UX metrics to the mix as kind of the second level of measurement, like time on site and those types of things. Not saying again that just time on site matters, but I guess if you find a good set of different KPIs and metrics to track, I think then that makes a lot of sense. But ultimately, again, I totally agree on traffic being the probably most kind of reliable metric to see uplifts, or the other way around, depending on how the tests go. And like another comment in terms of testing in general, maybe I agree. Testing off-page stuff is extremely hard. I mean, you can't change things as fast as you can change things on site. And then I guess also for mid to bigger size domains, the impact is more on the kind of complex internal testing. I mean, as much as I love to just change headlines and things around, I mean, I think we all agree on the fact that this is usually minor things. What I really love was Will's approach to internal linking, because that is ultimately, it's the single biggest thing to get right in my mind, like generally from an SEO perspective, but also to test that on a very large scale is incredibly hard. But I think if you can figure that out, that's probably the biggest gain that you can get from testing things from an SEO perspective.
So, Bastian, what are some of the biggest mistakes that people tend to make with testing? Is it selecting the wrong things to test? Is it things that perhaps aren't ROI appropriate to test, or perhaps selecting things that are too difficult to actually win and make a difference quickly within the business, or something else?
I think it's not so much about, I think you can't test the wrong things. I mean, it's like you can test everything, right? I mean, that can go one way or the other. That's fine. I think it's more about reliable data and a proper sample size of data, because that's where usually you have those crazy ideas to test, and then you have like 10 people that end up on the test. I mean, that's not anyhow statistically significant. So I think there's no outcome that validates the test one way or the other. So I think it's more about thinking, I mean, of course it's the idea or the test concept in general, but ultimately you can test whatever you want as long as you have enough data and or enough people ending up on that test. I think it's more that issue that I've seen a lot, where like they set up tests, not necessarily just for SEO, but general testing scenarios that then run for like half a year without any significance. I mean, that's just not, because then what happens, and you have seasonality is coming in and those kind of things. So then tests get flawed. I guess it's more the general scenario that I see where things go wrong.
So also joining us today is Chris Green. So Chris, what are your thoughts? What areas of SEO are you focusing on with regards to testing at the moment?
I think for us, the testing side is actually, it kind of comes back to what Bastian was saying around some of the challenges of testing, and a lot of that is sample size and the right kind of client insight to test on. I think it might be better to start with the barriers to entry, and why actually a lot of my clients aren't being tested is, frankly, they don't get enough traffic for us to see improvements, and rankings as a proxy is quite pitiful, which is the kind of point of frustration for us. And actually fundamentally the other side is the cost barrier to entry for most clients is too prohibitive. They don't get enough traffic for that incremental difference to make any real kind of justifiable sense. I think for us, our kind of foray into A/B testing was because we could, which kind of sounds a little bit daft. I think I must stress, we kind of started playing with this about 8 or 9 months ago, and it's sort of starting to grow legs. We started testing via Tag Manager, which, if you want to talk about a wrong way of testing reliably, I think that's a pretty good one, because we learned a few lessons that way. Like don't, or not if you're going to call it a test and want it to actually have some data that you can reliably check. Now, that's not to say we haven't been in kind of using other principles of it, which is, injecting content or elements in above kind of a CMS level. That's been useful in so many scenarios. Now, we're quite fortunate. We develop about 90 to 95% of our clients that we market for, which means we don't wait for changes to get made. I'm not trying to brag, because that has its own downsides. You put a recommendation in place and it doesn't work, you're like, oh, well, at least it's not taken us 4 months to find that out. We can then kind of iterate and move on. So actually that's a blessing. I'd be lying to say otherwise. But what it has kind of shown us is that sometimes just the agility that you do get from being able to kind of drop stuff in at that level is really great. Now, what we are starting to do is we have a handful of clients and tests that we are starting and sort of percolating now. So it's a bit too early to say, but, touching on, what Will and Bastian have already said, it is kind of questions that we would have usually never acted on, or to put frankly, would have never dared try. We can do, and actually getting the client's buy-in to do something slightly crazy, when you can say, well, it's limited on sample size, and with one click I can turn it off, and then wait for Google to catch up. That's how we've been doing it. So I think it's in terms of A/B testing, I think it'd be fair to say that we're kind of still probably behind the curve, or behind those who have started. Well, a good couple of years behind, but we're sort of lowering that barrier to entry, certainly for ourselves.
Now, one thing that we try and cover as part of the show is looking at the latest news to see what's happening. And a story that I picked up recently was the fact that Strategic, the company that Chris works for, have launched Spark, a Meta CMS for SEO Teams powered by Cloudflare Workers. So, Chris, would you like to give us a little overview of what that's about?
Yeah, I think in a nutshell, that's pretty accurate. I think we use Cloudflare's infrastructure to effectively build on top of and go around, the development stack beneath that. So servers, CMSs, we don't touch anything on that. We've effectively built a UI and just quite a convenient way of deploying to Cloudflare's own workers, which they do all the heavy lifting for us. So on the requests coming in and then the requests going back to the user, it makes the modifications that we've asked it to, whether it's injecting content or changing content or removing elements potentially, amongst other things. And it's just a layer it sits on top of. But for all intents and purposes, for the user, for Google, it's as if that's happened at the server level. So I talk about our kind of foray into testing using Tag Manager, JavaScript being an issue for Google. This is as if those problems don't exist anymore. So we've used Spark as a way of making the sort of power of Cloudflare's workers accessible quite easily, which will enable a lot of people to start doing things. I think it's kind of worth adding that it's not going to be a all of a sudden everyone's A/B testing, because I think we've already discussed it. There's a lot. The platform is, dare I say it, one of the easier elements to get right. I think there's still a lot of other things you've got a hypothesis, you need a team, you need to work out where you're going to level it, what traffic you need to actually get a statistically significant result. But the other half of our tool, which is kind of drifting away from A/B testing per se, is the ability to deploy changes where you might not otherwise have been able to. I think there won't be a consultant. Actually, there won't be anyone that kind of works in SEO out there that has had these problems at some point where they need to change something and they can't. And actually, for us, that's the point that's chimed more heavily. The A/B testing was because it sounded really cool, and we wanted to, that kind of, it is the future, is moving that direction. But actually, really simply, I want to add a content area on this page, but I can't. Wouldn't it be great if I could prove to the IT manager for my client that this is a worthwhile use of budget, if it works? We have even been doing that with Tag Manager, but it's not stable. And I think that's the thing I need to stress, is the situation where you find yourself saying, well, I need to get around the development team, I need to deploy on the edge to get my changes in place. There's a bigger problem there. But if you can kind of see a little bit of success, and then you kind of break down the barriers to kind of go, actually, stakeholders start listening to results. They don't listen to excuses, which sounds actually like a terrible cliche now, I phrase it like that, but it doesn't make it any less true, we've found.
Great stuff. Yeah, I mean, I remember a few years ago now, doing some work on behalf of a bank, and them having a CMS, which was about 10 years old at the time. And I don't think they even had titles or meta descriptions on their pages at all. And we ended up creating an alternate version on a subdomain of their site and canonicalizing towards that. But it's not something that you'd really want to do at all nowadays. But it's nice to think that perhaps a solution like that might work quite well for a situation like that. It would be great to get Will's and Bastian's thoughts on this as well. Will, do you have any thoughts or questions on what Chris was sharing there?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we're pretty aligned on a lot of this stuff. I think the most of what we're doing sounds very similar. I think we see the Meta CMS side as valuable. I think even especially maybe big enterprise clients struggle with those same problems. But our focus has always been on the consulting side, and tends to be certainly on the software side towards those bigger organizations. It's a little different to the kind of setup that you're there. And I think we just definitely welcome that bit of democratization of Meta CMS, bringing it via Cloudflare Workers. I guess that's probably the bit I'm personally most curious about, is I've not personally worked with the Cloudflare Worker side of things. So, the doing it embedded with Cloudflare makes it more accessible to the SME market. I think that's probably true. What's it like working with that? Have you found the technology pleasing to work with?
So far, yes. The short answer, I think it's using the same as Service Worker API. It's still easy and accessible. I think from our perspective, we almost want people not to notice or not to need to notice. The biggest challenge with Cloudflare will still be for people who don't want to go on it. So for everyone else that say my incumbent version thereof, we don't want to get out of it because they've scared us into staying here. Or my favorite, I've read a blog on why Cloudflare is bad for SEO. I'm not going near it, which is great. But I think the Cloudflare have made it very easy for us to tap into. I think their barrier to entry is low. We wonder what that might take us to, because they're on a big push with lots of other parts of what they've been doing to do similar. I think I don't know. At the moment, the barrier to entry almost seems too low. Whether or not that will change, I don't know. But certainly the name, we've always used Cloudflare on all of our clients internally anyway, even before Workers. So I think actually the benefits that it provides vastly outweigh what the potential risks are at the moment. But it's not, building a house on borrowed land is always an element that we need to sort of be conscious of. So
Can I just bring Bastian in? Bastian, what are your thoughts on this? Have you got any concerns or questions for Chris?
Well, not necessarily concerns. I mean, Chris addressed that already. I mean, obviously, right now being bound to Cloudflare is being bound to Cloudflare, right? But it's the same story for us, and that's also the same story for for Distilled or the Distilled clients. I mean, at the end of the day, if you commit for a platform and you build around that platform, it's just a need to decide at some point, are you going to stay or not? And I guess as long as people are happy, they stay. And if they're not happy, that's not necessarily the failure of the platform per se. So I think this is not a discussion specific to Spark. So I can totally see that from the market perspective, that it makes sense, because I mean, obviously Cloudflare is quite massive, even though I in terms of reach, even though I can totally see that, the enterprise side might not go to Cloudflare, which is fair. So I think what I was wondering actually, like Chris, maybe can you share a bit about how you guys are currently measuring? Are you just relying on the analytics that's already present, or are you taking any native data snapshots to just run statistics on, or how are you doing that?
Analytics at the moment, for pretty much the reasons we've already discussed. I mean, we've ran some separate experiments on rank tracking, and we started running some stuff on kind of hourly checks and what that does, and that just reaffirmed pretty much everything we've said, that as a proxy for performance, it's quite terrible. Actually, it's probably one of the most insightful methods you can have to check quick changes, or sorry, not quick changes, but if you're we almost sort of termed it sort of surgical SEO, I guess. What happens after a change has been made in the hours following it. Sometimes you can learn a lot in how results fluctuate directly afterwards, but for split testing, it doesn't feel right. I think the other potential paradox, and something that we worked in, is actually the more intently you track rankings, particularly on low search volume terms, the more likely you have to skew data or skew rankings or influence them. We've definitely done that inadvertently.
I'm sure this is the episode that could go on for about 2 hours or so, but that just about takes us to the end of episode 13, season 2. Just time for an actionable tip from each of our guests. So related to, or not necessarily related to, what we've been discussing so far. Let's go with Will first. Will, what is your actionable tip?
So I'm going to stick with the topic and theme pretty closely, I guess, and say I think not only should we be testing SEO and CRO together, but I think there's a lot that as SEOs we can learn from CRO, and so my one specific actionable tip is to check out some of the framework stuff that Stephen Pavlovich and team at conversion.com have put out. I love their way of framing hypotheses in particular, and describing their tests in advance and what they expect to achieve from them. I think that's really useful for anybody who's doing SEO testing. Anybody who isn't yet or can't yet do SEO testing, I guess a slightly different tack is a more organizational one. Is just start integrating with the CRO team and their tests, and at the very least try and get each team having an overview of the other's backlog of tests. I think being able to just red flag and say, look, that one could affect us. Let's coordinate when you launch it, or let's review this. Is a kind of more tactical organizational tip.
Superb stuff. Well, you can find Will over at distilled.net.
And now it's Bastian's turn. Bastian, what's your actionable tip?
Well, since Will already took two, I think I'd just like to come back to this, to the one topic I mentioned earlier. I think honestly that, and we touched on that, like the hygiene stuff, there's not much need to test. You need to just, you need to execute. There can't go much wrong on that end. I think I would really try, because like even conceptually, people struggle to figure out, how does my domain look like when it comes down to internal linking? What goes from A to B to Z? Do I have the right volumes pointing from the one to the other URL, etc. I would really try to come up with tests around that, because ultimately, from my perspective, especially if you have a domain that's say like 10K URLs plus, that has a massive impact. And on the other hand, the danger of doing it wrong is quite significant. So I think that's a very good and great scenario to actually test, understand if the anchor texts work out, understand that the volumes work out, understand if the link positions work out, and does that also work and is being used from a user perspective. I think that would be, it is a pretty complex scenario. Probably break it down into different ones. So that's my tip 1B, if you so will. Break it down into different single tests, and make sure you have enough volume to actually test what you're trying to test. I think that's pretty important also.
Oh, fantastic. That's amazing. You can find Bastian over at pa.ag.
And let's see if we can get a bonus tip as well. Chris, can we get an actionable tip from you as well, sir?
I think I'm kind of going to be cheeky and have two, but they're virtually the same. The first one is kind of embrace the power of making changes, even if they don't feel like the ideal change. There's a lot of people that balk at a change that's like, no, this isn't the right thing to do. You should make the change properly. We agree, but I don't want to wait until I'm old before changes get put in place. The second one is that actually, these platforms, the main thing they give us is knowledge, because the changes themselves are kind of transitory. They're kind of ephemeral. They don't take shape. They're on the edge. They're not on your server. They're not in your code base. So everything you commit to that is knowledge and learning, and it needs to contribute to something else. And I think people aren't aware of enough of that yet. I think for many, it feels almost too convenient, or on the other side, too scary. But we're on a journey to learning stuff. And, if you test it and it works, why the hell wouldn't you make it better?
Wonderful. Well, you can find Chris at strategic.co, and that's IQ is how it's spelled.
Sorry.
And I'm David Bain. I've been your co-host. You can find me over at digitalmarketingradio.com as well. Judith, what are your thoughts on today's show?
I think that testing is so important. I've been in SEO for over 20 years, and I wouldn't be here today doing what I'm doing if it wasn't for testing all those years ago and testing until now. If we don't test, we're doomed to fail. But we've got to prepare our tests, and we can't just go at them haphazardly. So, always make sure that you, as Will has already mentioned, you know what you're testing, you know what you're looking for, you know what your aims and goals are, and you come at it in a scientific way. Don't just think, oh, well, I'll just try this to see if it works. Have a methodology in place and know what you're trying to get out of it.
Wonderful. And where can we find you?
Well, since I've been your other co-host for today, you can find me over at decapit.com, or where all fine chocolate is sold.
Indeed. And all over the place. We will be recording the next episode, Season 2, Episode 14 of The Scoop, at the same time, same place, the SEO Rush YouTube channel on Wednesday, the 16th of January, for a show that will focus on social media content that converts.
Joining us live will be Ian Anderson Gray from IAG.me and Lilach Bullock from lilachbullock.com. So make sure you join them. And if you liked what you heard today, make sure you subscribe to the audio podcast too. Just head over to semrush.com/podcast and find the link there to your favorite show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Android, and all other good podcast stores. And don't just listen, kids. Subscribe to the show. It would be chalk-tastic if you did.
Indeedy. But until next time, be fantabulous and do one thing that's good. Adios.